Fantastic. So welcome and thank you once again. Hello, Ben. I am delighted to have this opportunity once again for us to share in our usual supported housing supervisors learning community. And today we are really embarking on a discourse that is certainly belated, but in essence, still timely and relevant and topical to the world surrounding us, the world both personally and professionally, and in all that we do, we are definitely encountering the subject of grief and loss and how do we cope and build resilience throughout that process. So certainly today, I hope that we are able to really engage actively in a discussion around how this presents in your space and how you are coping with it in your role as a supervisor and a leader, and how it certainly may be able to impact how the people that you lead, you supervise, as well as the people that you ultimately serve may be impacted by the knowledge, skills, and resources that are garnered and fostered to really ensure that this significant subject is appropriately and effectively addressed. So once again, thank you certainly for being part of this. So today's learning community is really going to be focused on, I like to put it, bending but not breaking. I don't know if you've come across that term or a similar term of that nature. I think what's very common, people talk about bending and bend but don't break. And we're aligning this to the subject of grieving and building resilience. So it's really looking at healthy grieving and how do we build resilience as a consequence of loss or in the face of loss. Why is that so important? As we all are aware, the pandemic has led to a series of losses, from our sense of safety to our social connections to our financial security. And this increases not only as a result, obviously, of the unprecedented number of COVID-related deaths, but also due to the social isolation, the disruptive mourning practices, and the grieving process experienced both here in America and globally. And in one form or the other, we all are mourning our bygone lives. I think COVID has changed our lives forever, the way we see things, our sense of how the world is perpetually a safe place, and so many other aspects of our sense of who we are and sense of the world around us has been disrupted and permanently changed. So the hope is we can really look at how have we and how do we continue to grieve in a healthy way and build resilience from that. So that's our focus today. So welcome, and today's webinar, as you know, is hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority, and we hope to have an interactive meeting, and we ask that you engage as best as you can. The slides and recording will be sent subsequently to you by email. Please let me know if that does not occur, and we'll try to get that to you. We do our usual housekeeping. Certainly a reminder that we use the chat to raise your hand on the Zoom bar. The expectation is to respond to polls, and there's some information in terms of the audio call-in option that is there, and I added to the chat as well. And I hope that we're able to engage as actively as we can. I saw a person with their hand raised. I want to make sure that we are addressing that concern. I want to see who that is. Let me see if we can have that person unmuted to speak. So can someone tell me in the chat if who has their hand raised, and if so I can identify that name and get that response to you? I'm trying to locate you in the participant list, and Or was the hand raised by accident? Either way, it's quite all right. Okay, fair enough. So we'll just move right along. So what's our learning objective today? What are we trying to have as a takeaway from today? We want to really examine the relationship among grief, loss, and bereavement, and to really distinguish some common models and theories of grief. And ultimately, to really get a sense of what are some of the strategies or approaches or interventions that really support resilient grieving, and what does resilient grieving really mean? So that's where our scope of achievements we're hoping to garner from today. So we start off first by really asking, what is grief? When you hear the term grief, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What resonates with that term for you? And if folks can share quickly, what really it speaks to for you? Sadness, says Liz. Loss, so there's sadness and loss. Emotional pain, Rebecca, spot on. Loss of a loved one or identity, loss, says Jacqueline, loss, says Christiana. Sadness and loss. So yes, we're speaking to those raw emotions, those profound emotions, those significant emotions, right? And Brenda says death. I think we often automatically think of death, but forget that grief encompasses other events. Spot on, and we'll really look at that in terms of how much it encompasses. So, in essence, grief is really that powerful emotional and physical reaction to the loss of someone or something. And that's important to note, because we tend to connote grief primarily with the loss of a loved one or death. But it really is the loss of something significant and tangible to us, as well as the loss of someone that is important to us. Yes, internal pain, loss of status, lots of losses. It's really a consequence of a loss. So often the pain of that loss can be so overwhelming. And you may experience all kinds of very difficult emotions or unexpected emotions, right? From shock to anger, disbelief, guilt, sadness, all of those that were mentioned in the chat a moment ago. And all of these feelings are normal. They're a normal part of grieving. So grief is really that normal emotional and physical reaction to a loss that oftentimes presents in so many ways. But despite the pain, the process of grieving is an important part of how we come to terms with loss. So we don't want to lose that significance. There is no right way to grieve, in essence. And unfortunately, there's no quick fixes. So even though it's a natural response and it's profound and significant and emotional and thought-provoking, it really hits us in waves and oftentimes in so many areas. It is, in essence, a natural part of how we deal with loss. Does that resonate with you, the concept that this is a natural process that is really a response to a loss, and it comes, presents in so many different forms, but it actually is an essential aspect of who we are as a human being to really deal with any loss that we encounter? It is how we are conditioned to respond. Does that speak true to you? Absolutely. And I like that, Jesse. It teaches us to deal with pain, to deal with change. And oftentimes the hope is that we learn that lesson and be able to process it. So that's grief. And what we know is that that process kind of unfolds in many ways. But there are some segments or elements that we need to be cognizant of. And we ask the question, can you differentiate among grief, mourning, and bereavement? So what I want to do before we kind of hit that, a matter of fact, let's do this and then I'll give a poll that will give me some more insight into how this presents in your neck of the woods. So really, can anyone differentiate or give me a sense of how do you differentiate among grief, bereavement, and mourning? Because oftentimes we hear those terms thrown around. We want to get a sense of, are there differences? Are they defined differently? How would you define grief differently from mourning and differently from bereavement? And you don't have to be concerned about being right or accurate. Just give me your thoughts. Just want to make sure that we're sharing. Laura says, stages of grief is a real thing, right? And Sean says, grief always felt internal versus mourning feels more like an outside expression of grief. I like that, Sean. That's really indicative of how it really presents. Bonnie says, I think they are the same. And Brenda says, loss can be anything. What feels like a loss to one may not feel like a loss to another. So there's lots of ambiguity around these terms, right? But don't feel bad. A lot of people use these terms, grief, bereavement, and mourning, interchangeably. Oftentimes people use the word instead of the other, right? Ben says grief is a feeling and mourning is a process. So let's look at what the experts say, because we're all in the learning phase here. What is clear here is that there are some difference in the meanings. As we know, loss is really the fact, it's a fact, the process of losing something or someone. We're clear on loss. Grief, on the other hand, is the normal process of reacting to the loss. So it's how someone reacts to the loss. Grief can be in response to a physical loss, such as death, or a social loss, including a relationship, but it's how that person reacts. And Andrea says bereavement deals with close relationships. Let's see what the experts say. Bereavement, on the other hand, is the period after a loss during which grief and mourning occurs. Important to distinguish. Bereavement is the period where mourning takes place after a loss. It's the time spent for the, in bereavement for the loss of a loved one or the circumstance or whatever it is, whatever significant loss it is, it's the time spent enduring that loss. Mourning, on the other hand, is the process by which a person adapts to a loss. So mourning is how you really engage in coping with that loss, and that is often influenced by many factors. Mourning is greatly influenced by cultural beliefs, practices, and rituals. So when we talk about mourning, we're talking about a person wearing black or a veil, or engaging in certain practices in a church or a synagogue or a certain way of doing things. Really practicing that person's cultural beliefs are guided by those person's cultural beliefs. And oftentimes it is really the process by which that person adapts to the loss. So is that helpful? Does that make sense to kind of have a sense as to how they differ? Because it may be important when dealing with someone from a different culture, from a different background, when you're trying to express what those things are to that person and what it means to that person and how you may be able to support them in that process. So I'm hoping that lends some clarity. Fantastic. Glad to hear that. So there are some common grief reactions, right? We talked about them. And they kind of fit into some categories. We know the feelings. And people talk about grieving. They talk about oftentimes experiencing the shock of the loss, or numbness, or sadness, anger, helplessness, guilt. Lots of feelings can be associated with grieving. And the thoughts follow those feelings. Oftentimes, the first reaction is disbelief, particularly if it's a loss of a loved one or a person, Or in some instances, if it's a loss of a job or loss of a relationship, disbelief can be prominent. Confusion, preoccupation, and in some instances, a significant enough loss and engaging in the grieving can result in hallucinations and some really difficult preoccupations. And we'll talk about that as we get more into how it really creates dysfunction in the lives of people. There are physical sensations that people report: tightness of the chest, nausea, stomach upset, dizziness, headaches, muscle weakness, tensions, fatigue, lots of different responses. What's important to note is that grieving can take all of these forms, but it's not imperative that each person goes through all of them. There are some elements that people are more prominent for certain people, and some people are more comfortable displaying them or reporting them. Certainly, a lot of somatic symptoms can occur that people may report: shortness of breath, abdominal distress, challenges with muscle reaction, lots of elements of that sort. What I want to focus on quickly is spirituality. For a number of people, grieving can result in feeling that you've lost your direction in life, particularly if it's a sudden loss or a loss of a significant loved one. People struggle sometimes with searching for meaning in the loss. What does this loss mean? Questioning religious or spiritual beliefs often can occur. So there's a wide range of reactions that grief creates. And it's important for us to have a sense as to what they present like, what they can present like, and tune in to have those, particularly when we're focusing on serving consumers or serving clients, or even listening to our staff as they may be either experiencing primary grief or secondary grief from a loss. There's lots of misconceptions about grief, and there's some facts that balance it out. And it's important for us to be able to discern the myths from the facts. So how many of you have heard any of these? The pain will go away faster if you just ignore the loss. As a matter of fact, shouldn't grief only last about a year? Or oftentimes you hear that it is important to be strong in the face of loss. You know, crying is a sign of weakness. Saying that you can't function as a consequence of the loss is not okay. And moving on with your life means you're forgetting the person that died or forgetting the relationship that ended. Or more prominently, you may have heard there is a predictable and an orderly progression to grieving. Right? People grieve in a certain way. And if you're not grieving based on those particular stages, then you're not doing it right. Have you heard any of these misconceptions or myths? Do they resonate with you? Yes. Good to hear, because I didn't want to be alone, because I've heard some of these. That's why I brought them to your attention. And oftentimes it is, you know, they're believed to be fact. So then, what are really the facts? How can we really differentiate between those misconceptions or myths? And Seth says, I've heard them all. I feel that talking about grief in someone is so super important. Absolutely is. Because we all face it. It's the one unavoidable truth of any human existence. You can't live this life without having gone through a loss that you have to grieve. So what are the facts? If people tend to believe that the pain will go away fast if you ignore it, the facts are contrary to that. Trying to ignore your pain or keep it from resurfacing or surfacing will only make it worse in the long run. For real healing and coping to take place, it is necessary to face that grief and actively deal with it. So avoidance is only temporary and it's not effective. And that's important to know. There is no wrong or right time frame for grieving. How long it takes can differ from person to person. It's important to note that. And you can't speed it up because you desire it to happen. Or you can impose that expedition or expediency on someone else. And the idea that people can help by not bringing it up, as I'm sure we are aware of, doesn't really resonate. People who are grieving usually want and need to talk about their loss in most cases. Bringing up the subject can make it easier to talk about it. Unless that person has a specific reason for not wanting to have a discussion about it in that moment, that's okay. Yes, it takes however long it takes, and everyone is different. And it's important for us to be compassionate and thoughtful and conscientious of that. So we need to be able to dispel the myths from the truth. And there's lots of prominent statistics about grief that really brings the sense of significance to the subject. 2.5 million people die in the United States annually. That's just an approximation. And each one of those persons tend to leave 5 grieving people behind. And it kind of spurred me to think of the math. If 2.5 people leave 5 people, behind, we're talking about, and someone help me there quickly, we're talking about more than 12 billion people who are in a constant state of grieving, given those annual statistics. That's a significant part of our populace. 5 to 7% of children lost a parent or parents by their 18th birthday, by the beginning of adulthood. Startling, isn't it? And most recently, for each COVID-19 death, 9 loved ones were bereaved. And I don't even want to calculate that number because it may just put me in a state of grief. But that's a large number of people who, in many instances, may be engaging in a process that they're not familiar with or competent to manage. What we've learned as well is that 7 to 10% of grievers experience complicated grief. And we'll talk about complicated grief and its really dysfunctional elements. What we've learned is that about 50%, 57% of Americans experience close loss in the last 3 years. More than half of our population has experienced some significant loss in their lives in the last 3 years. And 32% of those are death of a family member or a close friend. What really struck my interest as well is that 20% of those were death of a pet. And we know how much of a proliferation, how much of a significant increase in pet ownership and expanding the family that way has occurred during the pandemic. And yet there's been some substantial loss. So it's important. I don't want these statistics to startle you or to dumbfound you, but it's important to know, establish some level of significance as to why we need to talk about the subject. We need to enhance our knowledge, skills, and resources around this subject, particularly to support our staff. Are these statistics, how does this statistic impact you? And Seth says very eye-opening. It is. I was looking at the numbers and couldn't believe it myself. But it raises the level of importance of the subject being addressed, particularly in the workplace. And what we've also learned is that we live in a grief illiterate society. And that is not simply a arbitrary slant. It's a reality that we've learned. Many grieving people don't know what it means to grieve, how to grieve, or what giving themselves permission to grieve even looks like. And it's the reason why many people who've recently experienced a major loss have no familiarity with understanding grief. And it often deepens and prolongs the feelings of pain and heartache and prevent them from accessing needed support. So there's a cost to having that degree of illiteracy or being ill-informed or uninformed about this prominent topical subject. What we've learned is that in the workplace, there's 75 billion annually lost by employees in the US related to grief. Whether it's time off that is not accounted for, people not showing up for work, people not being able to be as productive, a slew of reasons. But those are the numbers. And that's important, Paul. That the number of children as compared to pets. And I've thought the number of children would have higher, especially with school out. Yes. I definitely agree with that. What is logistically startling is that what we know is in our society, and it's a comparative analysis, we have one of the least number of bereavement leave or entitlement afforded workers. Most grief outlasts the 3 days that bereavement allots. The bereavement leave allots. 3 days. Absolutely, Odessa. I'll get this PowerPoint to you. As a matter of fact, it should be in the chat. There's a link to get it. There's a socioeconomic loss as well. Because many people who really, until death occurs, are a significant loss, people are not familiar with benefits that they may be entitled to or supports they may be entitled to. And then we have, which is, so damning but true, people become a lot more vulnerable in times of grieving. And we have a number of unscrupulous end-of-life vendors who take advantage of people. And collection agents that, somebody died 2 days ago, and the collection agencies are calling you, asking you to pay debts that it's not even yours. And I agree, Seth, and more often than not, true grieving is not even, you're not even engaging in that process in 3 days, yet you have to go back to work, right? There's an expectation that you need to get back to work and get back to normalized activities. And it impacts productivity and your ability to function in the workplace. So it's important for us to know that there's that level of illiteracy around grieving that impacts the workplace and the work environment significantly. I'll make sure, and thank you, Odessa. I'll post it in the chat again before we're done. So the link to the PowerPoint will be available to you. So it's important for us to have a sense as to how do we conceptualize grief? How do we categorize and put it in those categories? There's some standard models and theories associated with grief that is important for us to know. Because grief is a universal response affecting every age and culture. And yet there's so much ambiguity about the concept of grief. And a lot of our researchers put a lot of effort into categorizing, right? And we want to make sure that we're familiar with them. So what are some categories of grief? Some ways grief is conceptualized. So there's anticipatory grief, and it speaks exactly to what the words connotes. When we talk about anticipatory grief, we're talking about while grief still occurs after the loss, anticipatory grief shows up before, and often in cases involving terminal illnesses or impending end to relationships. We're talking about someone who may be experiencing Alzheimer's or cancer, or someone who's, in the throes of a nasty divorce or relationship disruption, or someone in today's world ghosting you. These are all significant losses that can create a significant amount of grief. And anticipatory grief can be challenging because you may be exhibiting all the signs of grief, but you can't really discuss it because people are like, well, you haven't lost that person yet. Or you're still not divorced yet, you still have an opportunity to reconcile, but you're experiencing, because you've seen it and acknowledge it as a loss, you're already going through that process. So it's important to understand that there's anticipatory grief. These things can commence even before the loss. And the normal grief that we talk about and we understand, those feelings, thoughts, spirituality, somatic responses that really are general and tend to, hit a peak and then kind of slowly we tend to create more of a life around us, and the grief takes more of a background in our lives. That's the normal grieving process. But then we also know there's some people who experience what is called complicated grief. And it's really a term of grief that is so intense and lasts longer than any cultural consideration or that is typical to culture. That's the grief that really becomes such an obstacle to people's daily function. And we'll talk some more about that. But according to the APA, it may cause someone to become preoccupied with their loss in a way that disrupts their daily life. That's kind of the classic definition of complicated grief. What we've learned is that in 2021, the American Psychiatric Association added complicated grief, or what is often called prolonged grief disorder, to the updated version of DSM-5. So it has that classification, as well as the ICD-11 also lists prolonged grief disorders as a diagnostic criteria. So I want to quickly look at also some of the common models of grief. What is probably most common to people is the stage theories of grief. And that's probably the most common element that people have a sense of in terms of theories and the way, the models of grief that we're familiar with. And there are a number of different stage theories of grief. I think the most popular element, or the most popular one, is the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. What we've come to learn, though, is that not everyone goes through those stages, or even, in the manner which they laid out. Some people may have certain elements of it and may not necessarily have the others. But it gives you a sense as to how to conceptualize it. And there have been some significant scientific research challenges to the stages, and we've learned that really it's very difficult to support that's the process by which people, the model in which people grieve, and the authenticity to that particular model. And there's been others that really lend more of a clarity to the process of grieving. Are these familiar to you, the dual process model of grief, or the meaning construct theory of grief? Very good, Brenda. Brenda says she's only heard of the stage theory. And for a number of people, it may be unfamiliar, but I want to point you to the reference. I have a list of them. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the academic element of that, but it's certainly important to have a sense of the different theories of grief. So in the interest of time, I want us to kind of move to the one that the model of grief that really presents some of the elements that really bring us into the picture. And that's complicated grief. When we speak of complicated grief, we're talking about someone so inundated with that distress and emotional pain that they can't function in their lives. And as I spoke to you, there's now a DSM criteria for really establishing complicated grief, or what is referred to as well as prolonged grief disorder. What we know is that it often occurs more in older adults, or people who really experience a shocking or unexpected loss. Happens a lot in the pandemic, where we had, one day you see that person and the next few days you hear the person just passed away from COVID and you didn't get a chance to even connect with them, to grieve the loss. You can't go visit them in the hospital. They get buried somewhere. It's just was so unexpected and disruptive. And oftentimes there's risk factors that are associated with comorbidities. People who have mood disorders or anxiety disorder are more prone to complicated grief. Same with people who have certain personality traits, like an attachment style, a psychological adjustment processes, people who have adverse childhood events that are very traumatic, also can have a difficult time processing and coping with grief. People who have limited social supports or compromised coping skills can really be significantly affected by complicated grief. So I urge you to really get a good general understanding of the symptoms and presentation of complicated grief to give you a sense as to what you should be looking for when folks are presenting in this manner. Disenfranchised grief is also one that has brought a lot of attention. We're talking about that kind of loss that results in a grief that is not appreciated or tolerated in the same manner which other losses may be. For example, unrecognized relationships, particularly people who may be in the LGBTQ community who may not be out but have lost a loved one that they didn't really share that relationship necessarily. That's a loss that you can't even share with people because of the stigma attached or the shame that may come from that. Oftentimes it's loss that are considered less significant. When we're talking about that, we're talking about examples of miscarriages or other such and I'm sorry to hear that, Liz, but I certainly can understand. Losses that are surrounded by stigma. More prominently today, losses that are associated with overdoses or suicide. That may be taboo to talk about, or people may not be comfortable talking about, or people don't have the same level of compassion to you. I'm glad to know that, Brenda, that you're able to kind of recognize this. Yes, it is not often discussed, but disenfranchised grief is important, and it speaks exactly to that. You don't feel empowered or supported in your grieving processes, and it can be profound. Or grief not aligned with social norms. One of the disenfranchised griefs that I remember that people seldom talk about is you think of as an immigrant. Even though you choose to come to this country and change your life and come and live in a state, you may feel the grief or the mourning of your previous home. And yet you can't talk about it much because we're like, people, you made a choice to come to America. Why did you leave your home, your loved ones behind, or native land behind? So there's not a loss that you can really talk about openly and get compassion and support. So it's important to recognize that not all grief and loss or mourning or bereavement are oftentimes publicly supported or compassionately supported because of either internal or external stigma, shame, and other such challenges. So it's important to note that. We want to look at how do we cope with loss? How do we manage those in our role as managers? And Odessa says, being a sibling that lost a sibling with a mother that was grieving was super difficult. I didn't even really know when to grieve. Absolutely. Very challenging. You could have been an adopted child and heard that your biological sibling, who you never met or don't know, died, but you learned that. Or your biological father or biological mom died, and you can't grieve because you don't know how it may impact your current family situation. So there's lots of circumstances around disenfranchised grief. So how do we manage grief in the workplace? Because that's what we're here to talk about particularly. The most prominent element is to acknowledge the loss. It's managing someone who's in the process of grief is not a tick off box exercise. It's not, I did this, I did that. You really have to embrace that element. You need to respond flexibly and support your staff in a way that is unique to their needs. So you need to start by acknowledging the loss. How people in your team react to a colleague's personal loss can mean the difference between making that person feel supported or alone. And that's why, unless there is some confidentiality or other such limits, you should really acknowledge that loss and as best as you can within the confines of that workspace or within the limits of confidentiality that you have. And allow and show compassion. Help to create an environment where grief is allowed. No matter how disrupting you may find the emotional ups and downs, accept the emotional difficulties as part of the natural grieving process and create a supportive office environment for that person. Obviously, it's important as in your role to provide all the details about entitlements and resources that that person may be able to access in the work environment, from EAP to support groups to all the other elements. And with permission, when that person is on bereavement leave, stay in contact unless the person doesn't desire it. You may not know how important it is for that person to have a listening ear or someone that they can reach out to. Be proactive in that element. Manage that person's return to work. Don't assume because the person is back after 3 days, all is well and they can just go back to normal duties. It's irrational and imprudent to do that or to think that. And how do we do that? You really engage with that person, show empathy. Ask them what supports they may need in returning to work. Within your scope and within your capacity, help that person to adjust as best as you can. Does that make sense? Does that ring a bell? Is that something that's occurring or something that you can see yourself enacting? Fantastic. You may want to arrange for coverage. You know, if that person in the first few days coming back says, listen, can I take a break earlier? Can I leave a little early? I'm not doing well today. Be a compassionate leader. See how you could work around those elements and discuss with that person in advance some of the things that may be put in place before they have to ask. And obviously, I know there's limits that you may have to face, but do the best you can within the confines of your work and your scope and your empowerment. Supporting your staff. Handle the situation sensitively but forthright. Do not sit around waiting for that person to come to you. Another person announced that they lost their parents. Reach out. I'm so sorry about whatever loss you have. As a team, we want to be there for you. Let us know how we can. Here are some suggested ways that we've helped people in the past. Here's what the organization has to offer. Ask about specific things that you might do to help. Seek expert consultation or guidance when grief is complicated. If someone is having major difficulties, do not be afraid to look at what options there are. Inquire with HR as to what EAP may be able to offer, what support groups may be available to that person. Be proactive in your stuff. Important tips about talking to someone who is grieving. Keep it simple. Be factual and gentle. As much as you may feel compelled to promise, do not promise things that you can't deliver. And don't answer questions outside of your expertise. Unless you're a funeral director, do not answer questions about funeral arrangement if you don't know. Link the person to that source. Be present and supportive. Ask the person what are they comfortable sharing, and don't take it upon yourself to assume what should be shared and what shouldn't. In some instances, even if that person may not agree, if it's the policy of the agency to share certain information, you may have to follow that policy, but let that person know. Don't surprise them with that reality. Avoid comparisons or oversharing. That person's grief is not your opportunity to be the expert. They are the expert in their lives and their feelings and emotions. Take a cue, follow their lead. And listeners, I think it's best to acknowledge your loss instead of saying nothing. Absolutely. Saying nothing is not an option. It doesn't work. But what you say is critical for it to be guided and not just what is the first thing that comes out of your mouth. So it's important to know what to say, but also be cautious in that element. What not to do when communicating with a grieving person. Don't press for details. You don't need to know every single detail. Don't try to avoid the subject or disregard it either. Or talk about what should happen. Particularly if that person is dealing with a significant relational loss. You are not a marriage counselor. Or are you an expert in how a person should process a divorce? Know your space and limits. Know the limits in which you should be engaging. Spot on, Rebecca. Yes, you should never assume it's too fragile to answer questions. Oftentimes, people want to have that engagement, and they're waiting on a cue to feel welcome to do so. So there's a number of assessment tools that I want to share with you. It's also available in the PowerPoint, and it's on the resource list. There's the grief intensity scale, which is a self-directed questionnaire. There's also the inventory of complicated grief, and I saw a misspelling there, but forgive me for that. But those are some assessment tools that are very helpful in that regard. So you can certainly use them. I understand very clearly there's a significance in terms of who can actually provide grief counseling. That's not your role, but anyone can provide grief support. And there's some guidance in terms of how to cope. Let yourself react. If you're in the mode of grieving, let it happen at its own pace. Get involved in physical activity to decompress. Strive to maintain your daily routine, which is helpful to keep you kind of on target and focus. Be kind to yourself, show yourself some grace. Don't be in a hurry to get past the emotional element of it. Process it. Stay connected to your support system, and if needed, consider professional support. Do not wait until you are in that rut to then seek professional support. If you know this is a loss, an anticipatory loss, or one that is significant, start processing and thinking about if you need to access those professional supports. Do you have the information? Can you link with them? It's better to have them and not need them, and vice versa. Resilient grieving. It's important for us to note that there's a profound way of doing that. And there are some strategies that I outline for resilient grieving. To really be able to maximize the opportunity to not just process that loss, but to grow from it, to become resilient from it, or more resilient from it. Resilient grieving really invites you to take an active role in the grieving process. And it's really how you tune into the positive psychology of that loss, right? Bereavement can go hand in hand in order to help people overcome major loss. It reflects on the positive thinking through that process and from positive engagement. Rather than exiling yourself in rumination, we're talking about facing that grief, facing that loss. And there's some profound ways of doing it. Focusing our attention. The brain can only take so much, particularly at a difficult time. And therefore, selecting the content and quality of your daily life is very important. Focus on the things that you can manage. Get help for those that you need to help support you. Accepting what you can change and what you cannot. You can't bring that person back to life, but you can certainly connect with the value they brought to your life, the quality they brought to your life, the important things that contributed to your life. You can focus on remembering that person in a way that impacted your life. You can look for positive emotions. I'm not saying ignore your hurt and emotional pain, but find the things that inspire positive emotion. Taking a walk, listening to music, particular person's favorite music, if it's a lost loved one. Or if you lost a pet, what was significant about that pet? Did you take a walk to a specific park and you enjoy that? That's the things you have to connect with. Create rituals in memory and keep them alive. Celebrate birthdays, celebrate those occasions that you shared with that person. I always think of make that favorite dessert that that person liked on the occasions when everyone else is there and speak up to it. Commemorate that person's life and their significance to you. Keep them in your life in a way that is emotionally safe for you. So create those rituals and share it with others. And redefining our goal in life. Because from a loss, we are never the same. Even though we may feel our world has collapsed, we can find ways. How can we rethink what is realistic? What is my best hope for myself now with others I care about? How can I make the most of it? I think of when I lost my mom, what became prominent for me is to keep an active, more engaged lifestyle with the folks that are involved in my life, that are around me. Pay more attention to relationships that matter so that you don't have to do the what if, what should I have done? Live it. Engage actively and purposefully and intentionally in your lives and relationships so that you can actually learn from that experience and build resilience. And there's a guided principle of informed grief practices. And I want you to, like I said, the information is available on the research page. I want to make sure that we're aware of that. What's important to note, and this is the one thing I want you to take away, even though we all are not qualified to provide grief counsel, grief therapy, which is a very specialized approach to intervening, we all can provide grief support. You don't have to be a therapist to offer grief support. It's more really of that supportive and educational things in nature, right? To help people feel heard, seen, or validated in a compassionate space. And it's really a person-centered, care-oriented approach rather than a cure-oriented. You're not healing that person. You can't take away their grief, but you can certainly be there for them, make them feel heard, seen, validated, knowing that someone cares. So we all can provide that support. What we've certainly learned is that given the prevalence of grief in the field, it is imperative that all of us at all levels really do our best to educate and be prepared to work with diverse clients and their unique grieving issues. It's an unavoidable reality of life that we have to face. And the more informed and skilled and knowledgeable we are, the better we are at being effective in supporting the people that matter and the people that we work with, the people that we lead, and the people that we serve. And there's some opportunities and some resources available to enhance your knowledge, skills, and resources around grief and loss. There's Journey Through Grief and Loss by NADAC. There's the Grief and Loss resources of the American Counseling Association and some other resources. So what I'm going to certainly ask is, what is your plan for professional development related to grief and loss? What do you plan to do given the prominence and significance of this issue and your current knowledge, skills, and resource? What can you do to enhance your understanding, your skill, your capacity, your competence, your confidence in really supporting people through this process? Think of it and do something about it. I know we're running short on time. It's an opportunity of a minute or so. If you have questions, I want you to feel free to ask. Do my best to answer those questions. Well, thank you, Seth. I'm hoping that you get the basic takeaway. As I promised, I wanted to share the information on, I wanted to share today's presentation and also ask if you have a moment or so, if you can complete the evaluation. There's a link for both today's presentation and the evaluation. I certainly would appreciate it. And I want to thank you all for attending and sharing. Please continue to have this discourse alive and prominent in your work environment, in your supervision. Talk with your supervisees as to how they're dealing with this subject. Is it something that they make a primary objective? Are they engaging in professional development around this subject, and link them to some of those resources? A number of great resources. I want to quickly share that while I'm at it. There's a number of great resources available to you, and there's a list that, so once you get the PowerPoint, all the resources are there. There's a tremendous amount of resources, from evaluative tools to resources to support groups, a lot of other elements. And thank you, Christina. Appreciate it. So I'm going to stop the recording, but I certainly want to